Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Jack Goldsmith, the author of this book. I want to thank a few people. I want to thank the Hoover Institution for sponsoring this. I'm a senior fellow of the Hoover Institution. It's a wonderful institution, and I'm immensely grateful for all they've done for me, including supporting my writing of this book. And I also want to thank Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution for coming and either commenting on or asking me questions about the book. I'm just going to speak for about 15 or so minutes, I think, about the book. So the book is called In Hoffas Shadow, A Stepfather, A Disappearance in Detroit, and My Search for the Truth. And I wrote this book because my stepfather, a man who became my stepfather when I was 12 years old, well, let me tell you the story. I had had two fathers. My father had left when I was a young boy. I had another stepfather. Neither one of them were very good fathers. I would say they were actually quite bad fathers. And, you know, I had what seemed to me like a normal childhood despite the absence of a father. I was living in the South. At the time when Chuckie came into our lives, I was living in West Memphis, Arkansas. And believe it or not. And I'm sure none of you have heard of West Memphis, Arkansas before. It's just over the river from Memphis. In about January of 1975, Jimmy Hoffa disappeared in July 30th of 1975. About January of 75, this really tough-looking guy, but extremely sweet guy, came into my life. And I was a vulnerable 12-year-old, and I just fell in love with him. And he was the greatest guy. And he gave me love that I'd never received before. And he was cool because he got us tickets to the sports events, and he drove me to get comic books, and he just showered me in love like I'd never had before. So my mom marries him in June of 1975, and it was awesome. It was like the high point of my life to that point. 6 weeks later, Jimmy Hoffa disappears. Now, this is a crowd there are a lot of my former students in the crowd, but there are also some people who might remember who Jimmy Hoffa was. Hoffa was this very famous national figure in the 50s and 60s especially. He was the leader of the Teamsters Union, larger-than-life figure, much beloved in the union, which was the largest independent union in the country, hugely successful as a labor leader, and also dogged his whole life with charges of criminality and corruption, and justifiably so. He did not respect the law. He didn't care about the law except as an obstacle or something to be negotiated to bring him an advantage. He also had extensive relations with organized crime, the mafia. I talk about that in detail in the book. I tell a little bit different story than the conventional wisdom. Bobby Kennedy famously pursued him both in the McClellan Committee in the late 50s and then as Attorney General in the early 60s, and finally, through some extraordinarily aggressive steps that Kennedy took, finally found a way to put Hoffa in jail. Hoffa goes to jail in 1967, really at the height of the union's power. And he puts a man named Frank Fitzsimmons as a caretaker president while he's in jail. Hoffa thinks he's going to be in jail for a few months. He was invariably optimistic about everything. He spent almost 5 years in jail. He gets out in 71. Richard Nixon pardons him. I have a whole chapter on Nixon and this pardon, and it's really an extraordinary tale. And I'm not going to go into detail about it, but Nixon pardons Hoffa, commutes his sentence. But he puts a condition on the commutation, and the condition is that he can't return to labor. And as I explain in the book, this is a result of extraordinarily adept, I guess that's the word, machinations by the Nixon administration to court the Teamsters Union, which is not an obvious thing for Republicans to do, for political support in the 1972 election. They had to get Hoffa out, but they had to leave their man Fitzsimmons in, so they come up with this idea of a condition. So Hoffa gets out of jail, but he has this condition saying he can't go back to the Teamsters. This drove him crazy. His effort to win back control of his union, which was his whole life, he did that from 71 till 75, and he couldn't overcome this legal condition that Nixon had imposed on him. There was a lawsuit in town on this. The Court of Appeals decision was pending. Starting in 74, Hoffa starts acting irrationally. He starts doing things he'd never done before. He starts threatening to expose mob ties with the union. That's basically what he did. And so to make a long story short, it's pretty clear when Hoffa went to the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, outside of Detroit, He went there to meet some mob figures to try to work out a deal to try to get his union back. And it's reasonably clear, this is the one thing that's reasonably clear about the Hoffa case, that the mob, it was a conspiracy among the Italian organized crime syndicate, the national syndicate, that basically decided that Hoffa was going to expose their unbelievable gorging on the teachers' pension funds, and to prevent him from doing that, they knocked him off. Now, that's reasonably clear. However, we don't really know what happened to him. We know that he disappeared. He was in this parking lot. The last evidence that he was alive was at 3:30 on the afternoon. He made a phone call because the people he was supposed to meet hadn't shown up, and then poof, he disappears. And there had been this was those of you who remember from '75, it was a huge deal. Front page news for weeks and months, and it's really been in popular lore what happened to Hoffa ever since. There's a bajillion theories. But one theory has stuck from the beginning, and it was a theory that the FBI told publicly at the beginning in '75. And that theory was that my stepfather, who had been Hoffa's right-hand man, he met Hoffa when he was 9, and who had been at Hoffa's side and was truly his closest aide for 20 years or so, 25 years, that my stepfather picked Hoffa up from this restaurant and drove him to his killers. And that was the FBI's theory from the beginning of the case until this day when you type in Hoffa and Chuckie or Hoffa and O'Brien, and if you read any book on the disappearance, they all repeat some version of that theory. So I was 12 years old when this happens, and my hero suddenly is this bad guy who's knocked off this guy, and all I know is that the world kind of changed dramatically. There's all these FBI agents, all these newspaper reporters, my stepfather's stressed out, my mom is in bad shape as a result of this. Okay, so what the book is about, that's the background to the book. The book is about, during my teenage years, despite the Hoffa maelstrom, Chuckie was an extraordinary father to me, and I loved him dearly. In college and law school, to make another long story short, I basically blew him off. I decided when I got to college that I didn't say this, but I'll mention it. I was very close to some very senior, scary mob figures when I was a teenager. Uncle Tony Giacalone was a senior mob guy in Detroit. Uncle Tony Provenzano was a notoriously violent man and a member of the Genovese family. And these were my Uncle Tonys. And I hung out with lots of other mob figures. And I didn't really know what they were about as a teenager. And I kind of figured it out in college. And I kind of decided, this might not be good for me. And for all sorts of other reasons, the things I used to love about Chuckie, I started to admire a lot less and then despise. So to make another long story short, there's a lot of tales in the book. I blow him off, I cut him out of my life, and I don't talk to him for 20 years. And the book is, I explain, I'm not going to repeat it here, but I explain the circumstances under which that led me to seek his forgiveness. I basically I concluded for a whole bunch of reasons, that I treated him badly and I shouldn't have done that. A lot of it had to do with having my own children and some other things that I had gone through. So we basically reconciled in my early 40s, and he immediately accepted me back, and he forgave me, and we never talked about the horrible things I did to him for 2 decades, really ever again. And in the course of conversations over the next 4 or 5 years, I had never really looked at the Hoffa disappearance. In fact, I didn't watch The Godfather, I'd avoided all things mob. I didn't know anything about it because I tried to separate myself from it in my young adulthood. Anyway, over the course of our subsequent conversations, I kind of came to believe that he probably didn't do it. And I didn't have any evidence. I hadn't really looked at all the evidence against him, but basically the way he talked about Hoffa, what he told me happened that day, I could tell when he's bullshitting me, as he puts it, or telling the truth. And I thought, I came to conclude that I thought he'd been given a raw deal and that the case against him might not be so great. And so I basically said, why don't you let me write a book about this? Why don't you tell me your side of the story? I'll do some work, and I'll try to give you, certainly you couldn't be treated worse than you've been treated by history. This is a guy who has been uniformly condemned as responsible for the murder for 44 years now. And also I did it as to make up for the terrible things I'd done to him for 20 years, as I saw it. So after I was surprised at how much he hemmed and hawed, because my one condition was, you have to tell me the truth. That's what I said. When he agreed to the book, I said, I only have one condition: you have to tell me the truth. Now, my stepfather is truth challenged. He's a famous, notorious liar. And I had experienced this from a young man, so this is a bit of a problem when you're trying to exonerate a man from a crime and he's your main witness and he's a famous liar. But in any event, so the book is about, that's where the book begins. I decided I was going to look into his life with Hoffa and learn as much as I could about that and figure out what really happened in the disappearance. It's also about my relationship to Chuckie over the course of my life, and my changing views of him and his changing views of mine, our very complicated relationship. The book, for better or worse, has a pretty broad sweep. It talks about the rise and fall of both the labor movement and the mob in the 20th century. It really gives a history of the surveillance state, and there are some surprising connections between the illegal bugging activities that were going on against Hoffa and Chuckie in the 60s and my work on Stellar Wind in 2004. In fact, it was my work on Stellar Wind in 2004 when I came across an old case. Stellar Wind was the Bush administration's warrantless wiretapping program. I was working on it in the Office of Legal Counsel. In the course of that, I stumbled across this case called O'Brien versus United States, which I didn't know about, and it turned out it was about Chuckie. And it turned out it was about Chuckie, as he had always told me, but I never really believed. He was being illegally surveilled by the Kennedy administration, and how he won this famous Supreme Court case. It wasn't a famous Supreme Court case, but he did win one. And in fact, and then it turned out all the things he told me about not the corrupt Justice Department, I don't want to say that, but about how the Justice Department cuts corners and engages in illegal activities when they really go after someone, and he didn't put it quite that articulately, although even if it wasn't so articulate, it turned out that he was largely right about what he said about the Justice Department. So there's a large chunk of the book is about that. There are lots of historical ironies. Bobby Kennedy, I'm pretty hard on Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy, there are two historical ironies about Bobby Kennedy. He thought that he was helping the labor movement by trying to get rid of Hoffa, and the way he did it, Hoffa was a contributing factor, damaged the labor movement, and I talk about that. Bobby Kennedy was also sure that decapitating Hoffa, getting him out of the Teamsters Union, would result in the mob having less influence in the Teamsters. Exactly the opposite happened. For reasons I explained, Hoffa was keeping the mob at bay. And when Hoffa went to jail, his successor, they just overwhelmed the Teamsters Union. So Bobby Kennedy was basically wrong about both of those things. I have two chapters on Kennedy and Hoffa. And then there's a lot of other things in the book. And the book is really about also, as I say, Chuckie's extraordinary relationship with Hoffa during all of this. He met Hoffa in the early 1940s and fell in love with him the moment he met him. And of course, it's about also just imagine how devastating it was. And I didn't tell you the best part. I think it's the best part. I also think I do a pretty good job of exonerating Chuckie, which is what I set out to do. And you can be the judge of that if you read the book, but the best piece of evidence is, it turns out, as I discovered, and I have much about this, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Attorney in Detroit have for many decades believed that Chuckie didn't do it and that their early theory was wrong. Now, of course, they never reported this. So this early theory that they let out there was just staying out there. And even though they came to suspect other people and they came to develop reasons he didn't do it, in addition to the stuff I figured out, it turns out there's an easy mechanism to leak things and charge people with crimes in an effort to coerce them, but there's not really a mechanism to unwind that when you find you make a mistake. Nobody wants to take responsibility for that. So a large chunk of the book is about that. And finally, the book is, I think, really about my relationship with Chuckie, what he taught me, what I think I taught him, what I learned from him. At the center of our relationship was his commitment to omerta, the Sicilian commitment to not talking about things you're not supposed to talk about. Chuckie's half Irish, half Sicilian, but he's essentially Sicilian, and he believes that stuff to his core. In fact, it's his core commitment. So throughout the book, there are his efforts to help me understand without telling me things he's not supposed to, and that tension, or I'm not sure it was a tension, that dynamic persisted throughout the book until literally the last page. I think I'll stop there. And that's a lot of stuff. And,
yeah, it is.
And you see what Bill has to say.
First of all,
thank you.
I'll show for you first.
Okay.
Read this book. You will never read another book like this book.
That may be true. That's an ambiguous statement.
Well, you will not waste your time if you read this book. There's a sort of a second phase feminist slogan, the personal is the political. I've never seen it so clearly exemplified as in this book, where what started out, I think, as a father-son tale turned out to be intertwined with your professional career in ways that really boggled the mind. You know, they defy probability, if not quite description. So what I'm just going to do, I'm going to backfill
Okay,
for
great.
a few minutes,
Please.
and then invite you perhaps to comment on a few things that you touched on only in passing. So here are 4 big themes that I took from this book. Theme number 1, prosecutorial discretion. Right? You reproduce the guts of one of my great heroes, Robert Jackson, famous speeches, where he talks about the almost unlimited powers that prosecutors have to make decisions that can make or break other people's lives. And you clearly put Robert Kennedy's war against Hoffa, into this category, and you put it. It's part of a broader category that you talk about in this book, which I will call abuses of power, right? Because you have you have a really tough-minded description of the way in which congressional hearings run amok. Not only the McCarthy hearings, but also the McClellan hearings, can destroy individuals outside the legal process and therefore with no possibility of redress on the part of the people who have been, who have been wronged. And so here is your summary judgment on all of this, and especially Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy and his government colleagues neglected, elided, or interpreted away ethical and legal restrictions that are supposed to channel and constrain the federal government's colossal power to destroy one's reputation and liberty. Close quote. So this leads to question number 1. I came away really chilled by this description of prosecutorial discretion run amok without redress. Are there any changes that might be imaginable or that you could imagine that might allow what is valid and necessary about prosecutorial discretion to survive, but to reduce the probability that these sorts of abuses will occur, because they are really chilling? That's so.
You want to go through everything, or do you want me to answer it seriatim?
Why don't you answer?
I don't have a good answer for that.
Right.
I learned, there are a lot of things I learned in writing this book, and I was naive about a lot of things, and I learned in ways I never appreciated how dangerous the power of the prosecutor was, especially when the prosecutor decides he's going to go after someone, or she's going to go after someone. And they can, as Jackson said in his speech, Jackson was exactly right in his speech, that there's really nothing that prevents a prosecutor from deciding to go after someone and using all the extraordinary tools at his or her discretion and all the extraordinary array of criminal laws. And this happened several times in the book. I think it's inherent in the prosecutorial process. And I don't have great ideas about how to control this abuse. Kennedy, I will say, obviously the way this gets controlled, there are all sorts of guidelines for U.S. attorneys. There are all sorts of norms that usually have bite. But, they probably don't have enough bite. And Kennedy was an extreme example. What he did with Hoffa, let me be clear, Hoffa was a bad guy. Mm-hmm. He committed he was a multiple criminal law violator for decades. But Bobby decided, and this shocking thing was, in the first Nixon-Kennedy debate, John F. Kennedy said, the first thing I'm going to do, me and my brother are going to do when I win the presidency, is put Hoffa in jail. I mean, it's really kind of an amazing thing. We would get upset about that today if someone said it. So the norms have changed. Kennedy was an example, is a famous example of prosecutorial overreach. And I think in the normal steady state, I'm really not an expert on this, in the normal steady state, the norms work pretty well. But if an attorney general or a prosecutor decides they want to go after someone, and we've seen this, they can go after someone and cause them enormous damage, just having to defend against the investigation, if not being able to defend themselves at trial. So I don't have any, I'm not an expert on that, and I don't have any great solutions.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to flag that as a big running sore in our legal system, and we really have to depend on prosecutorial self-restraint.
Yes, that's right.
And I don't think most people, I certainly didn't understand that until I read this book, but it's going to stick with me. You know, the importance of norms that are not legal norms in order to police the practice of law that can inflict, I mean, because there's a huge asymmetry of power, you know, between the government and individuals, and you don't have to be a civil libertarian, a dyed-in-the-wool civil libertarian to see that at work. Okay, number two. There's a distinction between abuses of power, but within technically the law and the Constitution, and outright breaches of law and the Constitution. The second thing that really brought me up short in this book was your recitation, going back to the early 1950s, of a long history of deliberate government disregards of the Fourth Amendment. Right? The protection that we think we enjoy against unreasonable searches and seizures. And, you know, and a lot of this has to do with surveillance. You talk about early on in the Eisenhower administration a Supreme Court decision that basically the Irvine decision that tells the government you can't do this. And you know, and then there's a transaction between J. Edgar Hoover and the Attorney General at the time, Herb Brownell, and the government does it anyway. Brownell could not have been unaware of the fact that he was authorizing activity that on any reasonable reading of the Supreme Court's decision was just not only illegal but unconstitutional. He did it anyway. And a number of instances, that you talk about, and you say as a summary judgment, or one of them, and I quote, the FBI bugs on organized crime figures were a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment and state trespass law, and they would cease a few years later when they became public. But you go on to say there was no accountability for any of the people who knowingly breached the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Okay, so I'm going to put a version of the same question to you about these Fourth Amendment breaches that I put to you about abuses of power. Do we just sit here and say, well, that's in the historical record and there's nothing we can do about that?
So I was surprised to learn about this. The history of
me too.
The history of illegal or wiretapping, which is much more ambiguous legally, is pretty well known. The history of the FBI's use of bugs, which was more clearly illegal, especially as applied to the mob as opposed to someone with a national security angle, I didn't know about this until I read this book. Mm-hmm. Look, there's a persistent theme in the executive branch going back to the 40s up until at least 2004 and maybe, frankly, later. And I wrote about this in an essay in the Atlantic that's an adaptation of the book. This isn't in the book. Chuckie called this backup. And the idea is that the executive branch interprets it. This is my interpretation of what he said. The executive branch interprets its own authorities, and it cuts corners when it's convenient. And there's something about the surveillance power, electronic surveillance, that the government has always, because of its extraordinary power, to get masses of information that's credible information because the target doesn't know about it. They have, since the 30s and 40s, constantly cut corners, elided Supreme Court decisions, and the like. Now, I think that what was going on in the 50s and 60s is, that was an era in which legal norms just didn't have the same bite inside the government. That was an era when Hoover was in charge. It was an era when attorney generals were basically, including Bobby Kennedy, were basically afraid of Hoover. even though when I was working on the government, there was an analogous situation where the government after 9/11 probably went further than it should have in electronic surveillance. That was another example, not unlike this, but the whole legal culture had changed by then. And I think that while this is always a persistent, serious problem, that was basically a transaction between J. Edgar Hoover and the Attorney General. Today, there's a giant infrastructure of lawyers and judges, whether it's on the FISA side or the Title III side. So while I think that, I think the system is much, much better now on that score. The government's always going to go too far because the government feels an imperative to defeat whoever the enemy within is. But I think that the kind of blatant illegality that was going on for decades, I think that's harder to happen now.
I sure hope you're right, because that's a perfect transition to my third topic, which is your own role in wrestling with these questions in Stellar Wind, which I'm going to ask you to explain in a little bit more detail in just a minute. But here's the way I read your book. Operation Stellar Wind represented what you regarded, in many respects, as a clear violation of law, because it was surveillance without the warrants that were on their face required by FISA. I think that's an accurate summary of one strand of your argument.
And one strand of Stellar Wind, yes.
One strand of Stellar. Nevertheless, these parts of Stellar Wing that you regarded as flatly contrary to law were approved by the then Attorney General, John Ashcroft, who we know from other incidents in his tenure was an honorable man, the famous hospital bed scene.
In connection with this program.
I'm sorry?
In connection with
this program, and recertified, so to speak, on multiple occasions by the Office of Legal Counsel.
Including me.
Including
you.
In some respects. Yeah. In some respects, but not all respects. And so you didn't regard the portions of this operation that you termed flatly illegal. You didn't regard that as a close call, as far as I can tell from this.
If it had been a close call, I wouldn't have.
Right, exactly.
I wouldn't have.
That's okay.
What I did.
That
close call went to the government.
Of course it. Okay, so that tees up my question. Not a close call in the respects in which you found yourself compelled to say no to the President of the United States. But the Attorney General said yes. OLC said yes, not once, but multiple times. What gives? How do you explain this? Because you might think that the Attorney General of the United States and the fine lawyers at OLC would be one of the penultimate, if not the final, bulwarks against illegality.
So what explains that, I've talked about this before in other contexts. So obviously I wasn't there, and I don't know what explains it. These opinions were, and I don't know anyone, there are very few people who disagree with me on this, they were poor. And they made extremely weak legal arguments. The explanation is that people were freaked out after 9/11. They panicked, they acted quickly, they cut corners in terms of process, and it was a very complicated statutory regime, and they needed to do what they wanted to do, and they did it. I mean, the amazing thing is, according to the Inspector General report, this is before I got there, they decided on Stellar, the White House and the NSA and maybe someone else in the Justice Department, they decided on Stellar Wind without receiving any Justice Department sign-off. They gave the Attorney General the authorization, Ashcroft, and said, you need to sign this. And this is according to the Inspector General, and he signed it without doing any legal analysis. Look, it was...
The Attorney General, let me repeat this. Yeah. The Attorney General of the United States...
According to the Inspector General, that's right.
...signed off on a very extensive surveillance operation without even soliciting a legal analysis?
That is what the Inspector General said. Listen, I have always... this was what I did was very difficult then, and I think that the people that came before me blew it, but but for the grace of God go I. Who knows what anyone would have done in September, October of 2001 in the face of this really scary enemy and in the face of this law that did not anticipate this. Now, the proper thing to do would have been to go to Congress, have a debate about it, and do it that way. They didn't do it that way. Even
though Congress was in a very compliant mood at that point.
I think that was a different book about how the Bush administration should have worked more with Congress. They would have been in much better shape. But in any event, I actually think the episode in the early 2000s is a nice contrast to go back to the last question with Hoover. The relationship, so in this incredibly scary context, the scariest context maybe since Pearl Harbor or since maybe the high points of the Cold War, the government acted and cut corners. They were afraid. That's what the government always does traditionally. And the system, there were a lot of lawyers who were looking at this. There were the judges looking at this. Even if I hadn't have been there, this would have come out. It would have corrected itself. And it was just much more, it was a highly legalized, highly process-based system by that time. And they cut corners, no doubt, for a couple of years. But it stands in sharp contrast to the really absence of scrutiny at all that went on for decades earlier. So you go back to your earlier question, this is a tough problem, but I think the government is much better organized than it used to be to not allow kind of off-the-reservation legal analysis to persist for a very, very long time.
Well, here's my takeaway. I don't think either of us is a dyed-in-the-wool civil libertarian by instinct.
I'm probably not.
And I'm not either, right? But one of the things that I take away is that after the manifestation of a national security threat, there is need for heightened legal and constitutional vigilance because of what we've learned through the past century about how governments respond in wartime or when they think the homeland is under attack. And you can tell a story about World War I and what the Wilson administration did. God knows you can tell a story about World War II and talk about the breakdown of legal safeguards. Okay, the Roosevelt administration interns more than 100,000 blameless Japanese Americans based on advice from then Attorney General of California, come on, Bill, Earl Warren.
Earl Warren, yeah.
Earl Warren, got it? And the Supreme Court, when this is challenged, endorses it in the notorious Korematsu decision by a vote, if memory serves, of 7-2. Where else to turn? Right? The ultimate arbiter of what's legal and constitutional says, this is fine.
But what lesson do you draw from this? I mean, one lesson...
Well, I don't know that...
One lesson you might draw...
You wrote the book.
No, but I didn't get in these issues to this detail, although I have in other places. One issue you might draw is that law just doesn't... Legal constraint, that, as Jefferson said, compliance with the law is not the most important value. Lincoln said the same thing. And that in an emergency, it's more important to keep the country safe than to comply with the law. I'm not endorsing this. I'm just explaining it as a persistent attitude that chief executives have had in the state of crisis. Ex post, it always looks like excess. Ex ante, when they're making these decisions and they're scared to death and they're responsible for not allowing a recurrence of a terrible thing that happened, it's just a much harder call. And it's easier to do what I did. I'm not trying to back away from what I did at all, but it's much easier to look at this from after the fact than before the fact. The really hard call is in a crisis. And I had to do some things like this as well. The really hard thing is in a crisis to say no, to insist on a strict technical, even conservative legal interpretation. Mm-hmm. That rarely happens. Mm-hmm. That's just a piece of reality about legal compliance, I think.
I'd like to see the chapter you didn't write on David Addington.
So I actually, believe it or not, Addington is not mentioned in this book, I don't think.
Yes, he is.
Oh, he is at one time, that's true. I admire David Addington, believe it or not. I mean, he and I had some tussles, to be sure, and he made my life miserable. But he was he was not a corrupt person in any sense.
Oh, I never said he was corrupt.
No, I never saying, and he was a man of principle, and I didn't agree with his principles, and I didn't agree with the way he conducted himself. But Addington is not the evil guy that he's painted to be, in my opinion.
I didn't say he was evil.
Okay, well, I thought you were implying that, but anyway.
No, I'm just but given the way you characterized him in the one rather graphic episode that you do repeat in this book.
I do.
So let the record show. Fair enough?
Fair enough, yep, fair enough.
Right? I think I was entitled to draw an inference that there's something there.
No, so Addington did not like what I did in connection with this program, and he basically said a lot of people are going to get killed because of that. And, he didn't have to tell me that for me to worry about that, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, but if I could, just venture a summary judgment before I get to the fourth and final module.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution, by and large, was not drafted to tell us what to do. It was drafted to tell us how to do it, right? The Constitution, to a first approximation, delineates the barrier between permissible and impermissible means. The height of unconstitutional thinking is the argument that the end justifies the means. And what you see in times of national security is the tendency of that unconstitutional or paraconstitutional, let me be generous, paraconstitutional argument to come to the fore.
Yep.
And I agree with your point about the difficulty, particularly for the president, of acting at the time. But I think that Abraham Lincoln gave us a model of how to bypass the Constitution and respect it simultaneously.
I agree.
Okay? He famously suspended the writ of habeas corpus, but then in a famous message to Congress, he explained what he did, why he did it in the circumstances that he faced, and he submitted his action in full view of the public during the first terrible year of the Civil War to the judgment of the Congress of the United States. And, and if you're an emergency president, I don't think you can do better than that.
I agree. That's the classic model, liberal model of how to act in emergency, which is the law. Jefferson said the same thing. The law is not, legal compliance with the Constitution is not the most important value when the country is at stake, but to legitimate it, you have to do it openly, explain what you're doing and why, and let the people judge after the fact on whether the emergency did warrant the action.
Right.
That's what Lincoln did. That's not what the Bush administration did.
Right. I was sort of driving there.
I agree.
All right.
I agree.
Fair enough. Okay. Finally, we get to a module which, for myself anyway, I have labeled you, Chuckie, and the nature of morality.
Oh my.
Right?
Okay.
Because this gets now closer to what you said in your opening presentation. I was really struck by the moral complexity that underpinned this book. So at one point you reproduced, very close to the end of the book, you reproduce a colloquy, and here's the heart of it. You say at one point to your stepfather, is that technically what he was?
Yep.
To your stepfather, I don't want to put you in a situation that jeopardizes your physical safety or puts you in fear for your life. He responds, it's not fear, it's my honor. To which you respond, I don't know what to say about that, because you're the only honorable person involved in this whole matter, close quote. Bang. Okay, now, this raises some very interesting questions about the nature of honor and the relationship between honor and the rest of morality. Okay? Because when you analyze the two moral streams that flow into the river Chuckie, you come up with two, basically. One is Hoffa's morality, which is Hobbesian morality, which is social Darwinism, which is the law of the jungle. Do unto others, because if you hold back, they will surely do it unto you.
Right.
Right? And you can't wait.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, he believed in preemption.
Right. First, not just preemption, but prevention.
Prevention, right. Exactly.
Okay. And the other great stream of Chuckie's ethical code is Sicilian.
Correct.
Right? It's the ethics of the mob, and in particular, omerta. Okay? And this is the exemplar of honor.
And Chuckie believed it to his core.
And Chuckie believed it to his core. So, you know, I sort of feel like a professor administering an essay exam here. Explain.
Kind of feeling like a student here, too.
Yeah.
So what do you want me to explain? I mean, this is a great question, so what do you want me to explain?
Explain, you know, okay, you said, and as far as I can tell from the way you repeat this, with total, deep to the core sincerity, you're the only honorable person involved in this whole matter, and you did not exempt yourself
Yes.
from that judgment.
Correct.
Right? You are quite self-critical. You believe that in some respects you behaved dishonorably toward him, and that makes for a very painful reading. And the letter that you wrote to him, which you didn't mention, and the letter that he wrote back to you, which you also didn't mention. You
It's
know,
in the book, but I didn't mention it in my talk.
You didn't mention it in the talk, but I'm actually inviting you to do it because it's really extraordinary, right? And you say at one point, the uneducated Union Man, it turned out, had a lot to teach the professor. What follows is an account of what I learned. When it comes to the understanding of morality and human relationships, what did you learn from your stepfather?
So that's a great question. It's very hard for me to reduce that to even a few sentences or paragraphs.
I'm not asking. You can go on as long as you want.
Right. So I'll just say this. When I set out to write this book, I thought that Chuckie's commitment to not talking about the things he wasn't supposed to talk about, which was, it turned out, I didn't realize that omerta was so vital to his self-understanding, so vital to his identity. I kind of thought self-serving, crime hiding, opportunistic, I don't admire it. That's the way I started. This was an obstacle for me to get around, to get to the truth. And for him, he wanted to help me to tell me as much as he could about what happened in the disappearance and what happened with the mob, and he knew a whole lot of stuff. But he was stuck on this principle, which was drilled into him by his mother and a man named Anthony Giacalone when he was a very young man. And a couple of times, Chuckie screwed up and told me things he wasn't supposed to. And there was always a blurry line about what he could and couldn't tell me, but a couple of times he went way over it. And he regretted it so much, it really upset him so much. And it pained me to watch him struggling with having violated this principle. And so after a while, there have been a dozen Hoffa books with people spilling their guts about things they didn't know about, and every little thing they did to try to make a buck. And Chuckie has been wrongly tagged with this crime for 44 years. He told me a lot about what happened in the run-up to it, and he told me some things about the circumstances. And I don't think he knows what actually happened that afternoon, but he knows a lot more than he told me. And he wouldn't tell me anymore. And I was frustrated by this for a while, but over time, I came to admire it. Even though it's not a principle, obviously, that I adhere to, this is a guy who, first of all, in his relationship towards me was just purely honorable for decades, including when I didn't treat him well, and in the way he accepted me back into his life. And when it came to omerta, at the end, and we had the book closes with our last conversation about the Hoffa disappearance. And I told myself then I wasn't going to talk to him anymore about this because I didn't want to push him on this principle that was so important to him. And when we had this last conversation, he said, "Sorry, son, I'm not going to tell you anymore. I'm just not." And he goes, "I know this is going to upset you, and I'm just not going to tell you anymore." And it didn't. And it had upset me years earlier. It didn't upset me then. I was in awe of him. I was in awe that he was going to take his secrets to his grave. And I can't explain it more than that, other than this guy, you might think it's a bizarro principle. I thought it was a bizarro principle, but he gave his whole life for it, and he was going to stay committed to it until he went to his grave because he thought it was the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And I described it as eccentric integrity. That's my pen-headed academic way of describing it. But it was that, and I really came to admire it, and I never asked him about that stuff again.
So just to summarize, honor is unswerving fidelity to your internal moral code, whatever the costs to you.
That's one way of putting it. That's one way of putting
And,
it. You don't test a principle. The principle, you don't know if you're really adhering to a principle until it's costly.
Yes.
Same is true of courage.
Yes. Well, the Abraham and the binding of Isaac
Yep.
episode in the Bible makes very much the same point. I was really struck in conclusion by something you said, which weaves together the questions of morality and the questions of human relationships. Where you said, Chuckie was committed to omerta, I was committed to its opposite, but we were both committed to each other. And so we both tried hard out of affection to help or accommodate the other.
That's true.
Right? And so I was left with this very deep, I think it's a deep question, about the relationship between morality, including fidelity to moral codes on the one hand, and deep human bonds on the other. What are the circumstances under which one takes priority over the other? Is it this ineffable process of mutual adjustment that can't be reduced to rules, which I rather suspect it is? How do you know when you've gone too far in the name of a relationship at the possible expense of your own moral integrity? I have no answers for these questions, but it's one of the many virtues of this book that it forces you to ask yourself these questions, not just me interviewing you, but me interviewing myself. Okay, we have now a significant amount of time.
We got about 10 or 12 minutes, actually. But this is fine.
Wait a minute, I thought it was 5:30 to 7.
5:37, but what time are we supposed to stop, Aaron? I think we're stopped at 5:30, maybe 5:40. We can go for a while if there are questions.
Okay, great. Well, I'm sure there are questions, and why don't you take them, Jack?
Okay, sure.
And I've not read the book yet. I'm struck by the integrity that you just see in Chuckie, as opposed to the lack of integrity by all of these government officials who do what's convenient under the circumstances. So there's a huge, I think, discrepancy in terms of ethics between him and the establishment.
So I wouldn't put it that way. For me, I think it's fair to say that the book shows that even the most thuggish criminal mobsters have a principled, honorable side to them, and even government officials enforcing the law have a corrupt side to them. And I think that one of the points of the book is that we're all flawed, and that I'm very critical of myself, including my time in government and my time as a child with Chuckie. I think one of the things I learned from this book is that the bad guys I looked at, it turned out they had many honorable qualities, including, most importantly, Chuckie. And the honorable people I looked at, Bobby Kennedy, myself, and others, had these flaws that we were blind to. So that's the story that I would prefer to tell. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. Did Chuckie read the book? And what is his actual opinion of the book?
So it's an interesting question. It'll take me a few minutes to answer this, and I talk about this in the book. So there are a lot of things in here in this book. I told him at the beginning of this project, when I said you have to tell me the truth, I said, because I have to tell the truth. And I said, so that was my condition for doing it. There are a lot of things that I put in there that I knew he wasn't going to be happy with. He wasn't going to be happy with my warts and all portrait of his success as a union organizer. He wasn't very good at it. He always had an inflated conception of himself. There were some things he told me about the outfit, as he referred to organized crime, that he wouldn't have wanted me to say. And for those reasons, I was going to wait and publish the book until after he passed away. There's a movie coming out next week that is going to repeat the 45-year-old claim that Chuckie picked up Hoffa and drove him to his death.
This is the Scorsese
film,
yeah,
The Irishman.
Right.
Chuckie knew this film was coming out, and he basically said, I really want you to publish this book, which I think does effectively, at least for anyone who reads it, exonerate him before the movie comes out. So I said, okay, I'm not sure you're going to like what's in this book. So I actually showed him, before I decided to publish, I showed him a copy of the manuscript. To make a long story short, he said he looked at it for 5 days. I said, you got to let me know after 5 days because I've got to get it in the pipeline if we're going to publish this thing. he told me he read every word and he loved it, but he told me in a way that suggested he didn't read it. And I don't think he wanted, I don't know, I wasn't sure if he didn't want to know or whatever it was. So that was in the spring. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more. Over the course of the summer, he went through every stage of grief about the book. But of course, it was too late to pull it then. And all I can say is that finally, after, he's near the end of his life. He's not in good health. 2 days after the book came out, and they got nice reviews, and it said nice things about him, and it said, wow, it looks like this guy's innocent. Wow, this guy's this honorable guy, despite not being obvious that he's honorable. And when the world didn't fall in on him, and when he saw that, and he read the book finally. He read it very carefully. He said he read it 3 times, and he called me in tears, actually, and I hadn't seen him in tears ever. And he just went, it was just so sweet. He went on and on about he couldn't believe that I did this, and he couldn't believe that I got it all right, and he couldn't believe how well it was written, blah, blah, blah. And then he apologized, and he just was thanking me profusely. And I couldn't have asked for anything more. That's why I wrote the book. And then he said, and I'm sorry I was such a pain in the ass, because he was a huge pain in the ass. I mean, I spent probably thousands, certainly over 1,000 hours interviewing him. My assistant, I'll stop after this, my assistant who transcribed these tapes was in stitches for months and months and years, because he was a genius at deflecting my questions. And it was just, and so anyway, he apologized for being a pain in the ass, and he said he loved the book. He's 85, but he's not in good health. Any other questions?
Over there.
Oh, Brad's got one.
Jack, I'm really glad you wrote this book, and I'm glad you published it, because it is, as Bill said, it's kind of amazing that you were in all these places to bring all of this together and all this perspective. So glad you did it. You mentioned in your remarks that you found out that the U.S. Attorney's Office and other prosecutors who had worked on the case subsequently concluded that they thought Chuckie was probably innocent.
They actually concluded
how
that
did
not
you
probably
learn?
that
How
he
did you
was.
learn that?
So several things happened. When the first day I went to Chuckie to interview him for the book, he showed me these 2 letters. This is too long a story to tell, but I'll give you the short version. And the head of the FBI, the agent, the FBI agent who was in charge of the Hoffa case for 15 years in the 90s and early 2000s, had written Chuckie 2 letters. And this wasn't well known, saying, I don't think you did this. I have reason to think it was impossible that you did this. I'd really like to talk to you, and I'd like you to take a lie detector test, and we can clear you and exonerate you. And for a lot of reasons, Chuckie was not interested. He didn't believe the government, thought they were going to double-cross him, all this stuff. So, but as soon as I found out about this, I immediately went up to Detroit, and I spent a lot of time talking to FBI agents, U.S. attorneys, former U.S. attorneys, former FBI agents. I actually talked to about a dozen FBI agents who worked the case over 44 years. To make a very long story short, they told Chuckie, they have a chapter about this in the book, they said, they made him an offer. And they said, if you come in and we interview you and we're convinced about the disappearance, and they had all sorts of reasons I later learned for thinking he didn't do it, and you tell us the truth, then we'll give you a letter saying you're not a target or subject to the investigation. Now, I got a lot of advice that this was not a good idea, that we're going to be double-crossed, and then basically we decided to do it anyway to take the risk because he really wanted that damn letter, as he put it. And he went there, not in good shape. He spoke to them for 4 hours. It was an amazing, hilarious scene, which I don't have time. I try to recount in the book, too. Chuckie and all these people who've been trying to get him to talk for a long time, and they were like eyes wide talking to him about the Hoffa disappearance. He told the truth, and he didn't hide anything for 4 hours. And so we thought we did what you said. And they basically said a couple of weeks later, we think he told us the truth. We think the letter's coming through. We got to work out a few other things. Then weeks turned into months. Months turned into 8 months. And to make a long story short, they decided not to follow through. And for no good reason. Just because the people at the top didn't want to take the heat. And I've never been angrier in my life. And it was just an extraordinary, double cross might be too strong, but it was not. It was a terrible thing. It is. It was dishonorable. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you very much. What precipitated this, as you mentioned, was your review when you were Office of Legal Counsel of the Stellar Wind. And in your book, you mentioned, so the thread throughout some of this is the use of the surveillance power and how much discretion the government has to use it and what kind of rights should be in place to prevent its abuse. And you do talk about, and I just flipping through here, that J. Edgar Hoover in many ways was a seminal character in helping push this, and for years would always raise the issue of concern about things going dark and losing access to information as a reason for
Same
not.
arguments as you're hearing
Well,
today.
Mike, so my question is bringing up, here we are in 2019, several administrations after yours, and going dark, FBI directors and other people have been using that argument repeatedly, dealing both with technology issues like cell phones, but
Yeah.
other things. Access.
Legal issues too.
Yeah, I was curious to know what your observation is in terms of how we balance the need to protect those rights, even if it helps people we would otherwise concern, whether it's terrorists, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's the mob, versus fundamental things that we have to have prevent.
There's no easy answer to this question because there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off between, and the truth is the government doesn't know, and the civil libertarians don't know what the right trade-off is. And we're constantly, because there's so many, first of all, the normative issues are contested. There's so many empirical issues we don't know about whether ratcheting up this much more process will lead to the government not getting this many more criminals and just expanding that idea. So the truth is it's a balance. It's a constantly adjusted balance. We don't know. The government is always, understandably, I felt this way when I was in the executive branch. They're the ones charged with keeping us safe, and they want every power they can to make sure they can keep us safe. So there's no objective answer to this question. We've dealt with it in waves. We're dealing with it every day now, and it's a constant fight between the government and civil libertarian and courts and lawyers inside the government. I guess the only piece of wisdom I have, if it is that, is there's no right balance, and there's no objectively right balance. And the main thing that needs to happen is it needs to be as transparent as possible. One of the things we've learned, this may be a surprising statement, some people in this room who are friends of mine won't like me saying it, but one of the things we've learned after the Snowden revelations was that the government can be and should be much more transparent. Not only about what it's doing, the government was always been way too conservative about keeping secrets, but also about what the legal basis for its actions are, what the justification for its actions are. We're in a much better spot on some dimensions because of Snowden, because the government has learned to be so much more transparent in explaining what it's doing, why it's doing, what the legal basis for it is. My own view is that there's no perfect balance. We should be fighting about the trade-offs all the time, but it should be happening, and it can't all happen in public, but it should be happening as much as possible in the public realm. That's my basic view.
Just a quick question. This sounds like a fascinating story to take to film. Is there any plans to do that?
My agent called me today, and I just got a serious offer today. I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's premature, but I have to say an interesting,
Well, congratulations.
an interesting offer from an interesting person
I'm sorry, I missed to do what?
to make some sort of film based on the book.
Yeah, well, if I could just, offer a piece of unsolicited advice.
Uh-huh.
I think the appearance of the Scorsese film is an enormous opportunity for you. And if your agent is any good, you will be doing a head-to-head with someone in a senior position vis-a-vis this.
Yeah, they don't. No one on the Scorsese film wants to talk to me about this. I read an essay which I kind of recommend. I don't usually recommend my essays in the New York Review of Books about the book on which the film was based. It's a load of rubbish. But I don't know if that matters for the film. But this film is going to come out, and unfortunately for Chuckie, my book's doing pretty well, but that's not going to do as well as that film.
Right.
And everyone in popular culture is going to think, at least if the film is like the book, that Chuckie picked up Hoffa and drove him to his death. Do you have a question, sir?
What is your interpretation of him as his motivation for the 50s hearings and also the follow-on? And what was his own personal angst? Because his father was gangster material.
Yeah, as Hoffa often pointed out, that's one of the things that infuriated Hoffa, is that Bobby Kennedy's dad was a booze guy, as Hoffa put it. So I only know Bobby Kennedy what I read about him. I think that many people remember Bobby as the late Bobby, the Bobby from after his brother died until he was assassinated in '68. According to conventional wisdom, there was this transformation of Bobby from the angry, striving, self-righteous Bobby to something that was softer and more hopeful. But Bobby Kennedy, as a young man pursuing Hoffa, was he had many virtues, and he was beloved by the people that worked with him, but I don't think I've ever met anyone who was so unselfconsciously, morally self-righteous as Bobby Kennedy was. And it infected everything he did. And the key point is not just self-righteous, but unself-reflectively self-righteous. And he thought that there was good and evil, and he was on the side of good, and therefore anything he did was justified. And that is not, there's some people in the room friends of mine who like Bobby, but that's my judgment on Bobby. So that's what I think, basically. He was more complicated than that, but that's the essential portrait in my view. Thank you. That was awesome. That was I really appreciate that. Thanks, everybody.